It's really good to be here with you. I just noticed that there's like over 50 people, or now 60 people on this, and it makes me so sad that I cannot be in the same room with you and field your questions and look you in the eye. So please know I'm really missing that. But I'm going to save plenty of time for questions at the end. And like Cody said, if you want to send them in now in the chat, he's going to watch that for me until we get there. So I study high-risk behavior for a living, specifically the high-risk behavior that governs the changes that take place in the adolescent brain. And so what I know to be true is that our brain grows and develops up to the age of 29 plus. And these are very fragile times for different things to actually affect the brain. And so the first phase of brain development really is from birth to about age 11, 12, when we're growing neurons. Then the second phase is from 12 on up to 25 plus, when we're reorganizing those neurons. And it's all based upon the use it or lose it principle. So this is a really critical principle for parents and clinicians to understand. As a child's brain grows and develops, what they use make these beautiful long strings of neurons. So here's a magnified picture of an infant neuron. And as that infant's neuron grows up to about 2 years of age, you can see the thickening process, the organization of it. Dendrites reach out to other neurons, making long strings of cells. And here's a beautiful picture. This is called a pictograph, I believe is what it's called, of those long strings of neurons in different parts of the brain. And so it really shows you paths of learning that are occurring and reaching out. I just love these pictures. They're really, really cool. This is not an artist rendering. This is actually a picture of neurons that have been colored so you can see the different tracks of brain development. And so the part of the brain that I'm most concerned with is the prefrontal cortex, or the executive functioning part of the brain. And so that part is located right behind our forehead and a halfway above up to our skull. Now, what we know is that in the first phase of brain development, we are growing lower level executive functioning skills. And in the second phase of brain development, we are growing higher level executive functioning skills. So if you peruse through this list over here on the left, you'll notice that those are the executive functioning skills that we need to get up in the morning, get out the door, remembering our lunch. It's like the first layer of scaffolding of skills for our brain. The second level of skills are the higher order, higher level skills that allow us to move out of our parents' home, get into healthy relationships with other people, solve the problems of adulthood, and regulate the emotions of adulting. And so what is interesting to me is that most high-risk behavior begins during this the second phase of brain development. And so what we see is that it has a negative effect, arresting the development of these skills. And sadly, pornography is one of the high-risk behaviors that is starting younger and younger and younger, which we'll go into a little bit later. But what that means is it's having a negative effect and arresting some of these early, lower-level executive functioning skills. Just pretty scary and concerning. And it gives parents scientific justification to monitor these things, to talk about these things. And I'll give you a couple case studies that I've been working with too. So we're going to answer this question: how does pornography and sexually explicit media affect the growing brain, our relationship skills, and change our body image? So that's what we'll focus on in regards to what's happening to that really fragile brain development. Now, the first change that occurs as a result of exposure to pornography is slowly growing more neuroreceptor sites for dopamine. So scientists have been looking at this for the past couple decades, and what they have found is that overexposure to pornography can cause addiction in the same exact way that we get addicted to alcohol or other drugs, and potentially some other behaviors. And so I think it's really important to remember that the reward pathway is connected to our frontal lobe. A lot of us think that addiction happens here in our limbic system, which is absolutely true. The nucleus accumbens is the part of the brain that governs reward. It's where dopamine is made and lives. But we also have the ventral tegmental area back here in our midbrain. And so these are the two little organelles that are responsible for addiction. So when dopamine surges over a threshold in these areas, we become addicted. However, what's really interesting to me is that this happens at the limbic system level, and it sends signals into our prefrontal cortex that say, oh, this is really good. You should attach to this. You should really like this. And so this is why, and explains to me how people become physically addicted and what we think of as psychological addiction. There's a myth that you could have one without the other, and that's just not true, because you can't become really psychologically addicted to something until you're physically addicted to something in the limbic system. And so let me kind of give you an example of this. So when you're young and your mom hugs you and feeds you, you have increases in dopamine in the midbrain here in your limbic system. And your brain says, oh, this person is really good for my survival. Then it sends signals into your prefrontal cortex, your frontal lobe areas that tell you, oh, you should attach to this person because she's really good for your survival. So that is the normal reward pathway of our human brain. Drugs of abuse and too much stimulation from technology, things like pornography, video games, and other high-risk behavior hijack this reward system, the natural reward system. Okay, so let's take a look at how that happens. So these are the increases of dopamine that we see from normal healthy things that we do that are good for our survival. So food increases dopamine levels by about 100%. Sex is about 150%, but we have a threshold. We're not supposed to go over that threshold. It's the normal amount of dopamine that spikes in our system. What happens with drugs of abuse, like cocaine or meth, they increase the amount of dopamine in such high proportions that it starts to make structural changes over the threshold here. And we find that pornography does the exact same thing. Now, it's very hard to quantify this, but researchers have discovered that about a half an hour viewing of pornography can spike dopamine levels to the same height as snorting a line of cocaine. So we can't really say that watching it for 2 minutes is any better or worse, but what we do know is that when you're exposed to it over and over and over again, those dopamine spikes get higher and higher and higher. We'll talk about why that happens. Once the dopamine spikes get to the level that exceed our normal natural threshold, structural changes begin to occur in the brain. Those structural changes look like damage to neuroreceptor sites that produce dopamine, as well as new receptor sites that reach into that reward pathway that signal, oh, there's so much dopamine here, we better make more receptor sites. But then when all those receptor sites are empty because the pornography goes away or the substance goes away, we have all these new receptor sites in our brain that are craving whatever that was that spiked dopamine levels so high. So here's what we're calling it, is arousal addiction. So in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, excuse me, there is no diagnosis for pornography addiction. As a matter of fact, gambling addiction is just really starting to be looked at seriously as a diagnosis. The World Health Organization has declared it to be, but it's still not quite in the DSM. It's still provisional. Pornography addiction is farther away from that. And so we're causing it arousal addiction. And arousal addiction has been defined as the digital rewiring of the brain from too much dopamine, which competes against real life dopamine spikes. And so this is a pretty interesting study that showed brains of people who admitted to being compulsive pornography users. And so these are people who used quite often, even daily. And they took pictures of the control subjects who admitted to not using pornography. And when they were cued with a pornography trigger, the part of the brain right here in the in the striatum, the ventral striatum, you can see right here, that's really close to where the nucleus accumbens is. This is the part of the brain that governs reward, motivation, and seeking that pleasure. And so you can see that the brain of the control subject lights up a little bit, but not like the compulsive pornography user. So what this indicates is that there have been structural changes to that part of the brain. Now, interestingly, this is the same exact part of the brain that lights up for people who are who have alcoholism. If you show them a beer, a trigger, their ventral striatum will light up just like this, whereas people who are non-alcoholic, their brain will look potentially like this, or maybe not even light up at all. So it's the same part of the brain that's getting hijacked. Now, so this is a book, I actually have it right here with me because I have read this a couple times front and back, and I have referenced it in many of the studies in it in my book because it's just so comprehensive look at your brain on porn and the scientific studies that have utilized this. So what this, if I could boil this book down for you, what I think is important to know is that predominantly the research studies on pornography indicate that when people increase their use of porn, desensitization to the rewards of pornography increase. Desensitization, we'll talk about that in a second, and that brain matter related to impulse control, motivation, and decision making decrease. So not only is our limbic system lighting up right where this hook is in this x-ray, but what we see is our prefrontal cortex is actually dimming down. Impulse control, motivation, decision making, these are thought about and processed in our prefrontal cortex. So I think it's really interesting. I think about my limbic system as being my inner child who wants what she wants when she wants it. And my prefrontal cortex is my inner parent who says, nope, not such a good idea, back off, hold on, and controls the impulses of my limbic system. But when we increase this part of our, when we increase pornography usage, that part of the brain dumbs down while the other parts increase. So I think this is really critical. I've talked to so many parents about this. You know, have you brought up pornography yet to your kiddo? And they'll say things to me like, wait a second, like they're only in the 7th grade, or they're only, you know, 11, 12 years old. And it scares me when I hear that because I understand that parents don't necessarily want to bring this up, but you guys, porn hooks you and hooks you young. So it's critical to talk about this. So here's what's happening, and what I see in our Western culture is that sexual socialization is occurring by way of making pornography normal. So I've talked to the kids that I work with, and they say, oh yeah, I use porn. Like, doesn't everybody use porn? Like, that's just what you do. And a lot of times they'll figure out that that's the best way to learn about sex, from pornography. And so a lot of teens that I have worked with have said, well, it's just, you know, a rite of passage. You know, you've got to look at porn for the first time and figure out which kind you like and which websites you want. And so, you know, this just boggles my mind because you know, do you guys think this is acceptable? Like, is it, it's definitely what our culture is doing, but how is it affecting us? So let me show you some of the research about that. So the average age of first unwanted exposure to pornography in the United States is 10. And then the average age of the first search for porn is 11. So this makes so much sense. At 11 years old, we have a very small prefrontal cortex, but we have a fully developed limbic system. It is completely online and mature by the time we're 11, 12, our limbic system, that want what I want when I want it part of the brain. So if they're accidentally exposed while they're surfing the internet, or a peer shows it to them, which are the two ways that kids are exposed, then of course they get curious and they want to search for it. So I want to show you a graph. This actually is a graph that is in my book, and it shows you that back in 2006, high-speed internet gave us the ability to download endless clips and search all types of pornographic videos. And so what we see here is the blue line is the daily use for males. This is only a study that was done on boys. And as you can see, it was less than 5% in 2008. But by 2011, daily use of pornography shot up to over 10%. And in 2017, just a few years ago, what we see is that pornography is up to about 40% daily use in males. Now, what I'm seeing in the literature is that girls are not far behind this today. It is much more common to see girls using pornography as well as it is boys. Now, the more disturbing one is this yellow line. These are kids that were exposed before the age of 13. And, you know, right on the heels of high-speed internet, the numbers were relatively low. But if you check it out, in 2017, we see almost 70% of youth are exposed to pornography before the age of 13. So before their frontal lobe can actually make a decision for them about using it or not using it. So this bodes well for prevention discussions. We need to be able to have these discussions around 10, 11, 12, and 13. A couple of my favorite books for doing this are Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. So if you look on Amazon, there are two versions of Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, one for younger kids and one for older kids. And I recommend that if you have kids of all ages to buy both and start these discussions soon. They need to understand what the word pornography means. They're going to be curious about this. Parents also say to me things like, but I don't want to expose my child too young because then it will ruin their innocence. What I always say to that is, do you want your child's innocence to be ruined by other kids at school, by the internet, or what they may see on smartphone use? Or do you want to be the first person to talk to them about that? If you say yes to that question, that you want to be the first, then you've got to start younger. Okay, here's a reason why you have to start younger. The pornography of olden days, and I think this is funny because one of my old employees put this picture on it from a National Geographic in there, and I was like, National Geographic? He said, oh yeah, when I was a boy, that was our pornography. We saw pictures of scantily clad people in National Geographic. And now this was what I remember is that going out into the garage when I was a kid and seeing a stack of magazines and grabbing for one and having my mom say, oh, no, 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 those are your dad's. I didn't know what those were until I was older. But you know, what strikes me about this is if you bought Playboy, you would have to wait another month to get your next dopamine spike because they only were published on a monthly basis, or so I think. But in today's world, there are hundreds of thousands of sites out there that you can search different types of pornography within seconds. And instead of having to wait a whole month for the next edition to come out, all you have to do is click to another video to find something that may spike your dopamine levels a little higher than the last video did. So this is changing our brain faster and faster and faster. So this digital rewiring has some signs to it. If you notice that your loved one is watching pornography alone, they're spending more and more time alone watching this. If the increases in frequency of clicking and searching for more novel scenes becomes the norm, having multiple tabs of pornography open at once, constantly seeking to be shocked or surprised by pornography, and seeking instant gratification through watching it. Now, so what I know to be true about this fourth bullet, which is quite interesting, and there are a lot of stories in this particular book from young people who have been very disgusted with their own pornography use, because what happened is they would search for more shocking, more surprising pornography that increases dopamine levels higher and higher and higher, until they started watching things that they normally would not have watched, or that go against their value, things that are shocking but disturbing and disgusting, and the shame that they would start to feel after getting caught into those types of loops. Okay, so I mentioned desensitization earlier, and really what this means is that when you're desensitized, you are just less sensitive to stimuli. And so this is the best graphic that I can find that illustrates the effect of this without being very graphic. And what we started to see even just a few years ago is that pornography is reducing the sexual performance of young men and older men. And so just back in 2013, a study said that 1 patient out of 4 with newly diagnosed erectile dysfunction is a young man. 54% of sexually active 16 to 20-year-olds reported sexual problems. This is higher than the rate for adult men. And about 2013, 2014, that's when we started to see the numbers shift. The amount of people who are diagnosed with an erectile dysfunction is now highest for this age group, between 16 and actually 25, as opposed to men over the age of 65. Now, please hear me. This is true for women as well. What we see is that their ability to be sexually stimulated is desensitized when they watch pornography. And the scary thing about this is that sex happens here in the brain before it happens anywhere else in your body. So what we're seeing is that men are getting these high spikes of dopamine, men and women, high spikes of dopamine from pornography. But then when they enter into a relationship with a real life human, the dopamine spike is lower. And so you remember that chart, sex is about 150%. But if you've been exposing yourself to anything above that and had those structural changes in your brain, then real life sexual experience can't compete with the sexual experience that you have when you engage with your screen and pornography. So here are some red flags. Try to get them all to fit here. What we see in pornography and erectile dysfunction: lack of spontaneous erections, or for women, arousal, lack of arousal by previously viewed pornography, lack of arousal by previously mutually satisfying sexual relationships, need for more extreme material to become aroused, and decreased genital sensitivity. The brain has become numb to pleasure. And so I've seen a couple of female clients who have actually done damage to their clitoris area due to constant and compulsive masturbation because of addiction to their pornography. And so we also see that they have a difficulty having an orgasm with a real partner, and because of that, inequality in dopamine spike. And then also the inability to maintain erection with a real partner, and this is called impotent. Golly, I can't say that word very well. Impotence. And so when we see impotence occurring for young men at age 16, 17, 18, it's really amazing. It just scratches my head trying to figure out And imagine how many hours of pornography that young person has had to have problems with impotence at that age. And then, of course, eventual inability to get an erection even while viewing extreme porn. So that's as far as it goes, is that your brain is wired to search for a certain level of dopamine spike. And if you have created an addiction and those structural changes in your brain, then things in your body just will not react the same way to higher and higher levels of stimulation. So it's also important to remember that arousal addiction can mimic other things. People may look very ADHD when they become addicted to pornography. They may look as if they have social anxiety, but these things can mask the what's really going on with arousal addiction. It's this constant thinking about pornography, a constant wanting to go back and look at pornography, or when you're triggered, you feel an intense need to engage in pornography use instead of being with people or loved ones. Now, this can also really look like depression, and this is what I've seen quite a lot in kids, is that they become depressed because they don't know what's going on. They don't have the words to discuss this. And so they manifest with depression and also performance anxiety and obsessive compulsive kind of disorder. So some signs of severe addiction. It's important that everybody understand that there are levels that we go through before becoming addicted to anything. And so these are 12 symptoms. What we want to see is that if somebody has one or two of these, they may need to make a decision about continuing to use pornography or not. If they have between 4 and 6 or 7 of these symptoms, they may actually need to get some help from a counselor to intervene. And if they have 6 or 7 or more, so more than 6 or 7 of these symptoms, they may need to actually engage in inpatient treatment to explore pornography addiction. So a lot of these are self-explanatory, and you may find this familiar if you work in the addiction field, especially engaging in pornography for more than 3 hours a day, craving it, thinking about it, skipping social events or work or school to use it, scheduling around online pornography. And then, of course, online porn becomes central to life. I'm going to skip 6 for a second. Using to modify your mood or escape emotions, using it as an alternative to socialization and thus becoming more isolated, neglecting work, study, home in favor of using and watching pornography. It causes sleep disturbances. If somebody is unable to stop, or it's causing failing or falling grades, these are really intense symptoms. Now, number 6, I think, is important, which is going to send me to the next topic in my presentation about what pornography does to our psyche. So we've discussed what it's doing neurologically to our brain, creating new structure, changing structure, damaging neurons. But now let's talk about the blurring of porn and reality. So this is what I see a lot in working with kids, especially girls, is this idea of porn speak. So porn speak is the communication that you would hear people use in pornographic videos. And it's really degrading and promotes violence. It really does not represent what healthy, intimate conversation looks like. But with over 7 or just under 70% of people being exposed to pornography, they're actually learning this porn speak and blurring that with reality. So I have had kids ask me often, well, is that not what women want? Or is that not what I'm supposed to want? Or I really wish he would talk to me in a more violent way. And when I ask, why do you wish that? I've heard kids say things like, well, that's what I see in pornography and it really turns me on. So that makes me think that their brain has been socialized and sculpted by pornography to give them an idea of what healthy sexual intimacy represents, it creates a sexual script that causes confusion about the ideas of what is masculine, feminine, and what's intimate. And so I put this in the little bubble over the kids' head so you could see what I think they're thinking from what I've heard kids say. And you know, especially for girls, they really wonder, does he want me to be like the women in porn? And boys, does she want me to treat her the way that women are treated in porn? And what if I don't want that? What if I don't look like that? Will it be disappointing for him or for her? So I hear this quite a lot in kids, and I also make up that this is what we think as adults as well when we find that our partner has been viewing pornography without our knowledge. So we don't just see pornography in pornographic websites. We actually see it quite a bit in advertising, and sex has always been used to sell products. But in the past couple of decades, what we've seen is that sexual aggression, which mimics what we see in pornography, has also mimicked or is also being portrayed in advertising. And so youth who are predisposed, well, one of the studies that I read said that youth who have been predisposed to certain levels of aggression are about 4 times more likely to be sexually aggressive when consistently exposed to pornography. So what that says, if we already have boys in particular that have been has shown signs of aggressive behavior or more aggressive than others, if they're exposed to pornography, that most likely they will mimic that behavior in their personal relationships. And so what it does to our body image as well is pretty interesting, making us think that we're supposed to look like this, especially while we're doing things like that, which is pretty interesting to me. It's not just sexualized, but it also shares what our roles, our gender roles should be. And then, of course, things like, here's one from American Apparel that I was just appalled to see. And then there's this particular one here, what satisfies a hungry woman, and it objectifies the man in the background in this particular ad. But what you'll notice is that you know, she's really dressed in scantily, but she's got his shirt on, and you know, it's a shredded wheat advertisement, but this is definitely sending some signals about what gender roles and what men and women are supposed to do. So is this advertising art? What's the message here? Does it respect the roles of femininity and masculinity? So when we see advertisements like this, we need to have discussions with our kids and ask them some of these questions, like, do you think this advertising is okay? What message does it send? What message does it send to you about your role as a boy or your role as a girl? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And why? Those are conversations that I hope parents are having with kids as they see this on advertising, TV, and the internet. Something else that pornography is involved in doing is normalizing the hookup culture. There have been a lot of books read about this, and what's interesting to me is especially to read about the girls' experience and becoming desensitized to having emotional connections with other people in favor of just hooking up. And listening to girls in therapy talk about feeling dissatisfied and disappointed after hooking up, but trying to push that down and shame themselves for having those feelings because they're supposed to want a hookup culture that is glorifies and glamorizes casual sexual encounters and one-night stands. But you know, I see actually this reversing, and a lot of the young adults that I work with are starting to say, you know, that's just not me. It doesn't fit for me. I want an intimate relationship, and I'm going to wait longer. As a matter of fact, we do see across the board that our young children and youth are waiting to have sexual relationships longer than before, which is, I think, good news. What it's doing to adult relationships is having a negative effect, because we're seeing that pornography use decreases relationship commitment, decreases the natural sexual response, creates unrealistic expectations, and it decreases trust and relationship satisfaction. So when I do therapy for couples, I always make sure that I ask them in my intake assessment how they feel about use of pornography, if they use it as a couple, or if each individual may use it, and how that affects their relationships. And I think that it would be remiss not to ask modern day couples these questions, because the proliferation of pornography is it's just so ubiquitous in our culture. So there's a lot here. I'm sorry that it's so fills the screen this way, but I wanted to make sure that we got all of the ways that are the outcomes of teens who are sexually exposed to sexually explicit content. What the research says, and this is a kind of a study of probably 20 years, the past 20 years of research I've read on porn and the effects of porn, is that youth who are exposed to it when they're in middle school or high school grow up to have more permissive sexual attitudes. They're more preoccupied with sex, and unfortunately, they're less sexually satisfied, which makes sense because of what we've talked about with the brain. And then we also see that they have stronger beliefs that women are sexual objects. They're more likely to engage in high-risk sexual behavior, unrealistic attitudes about sex and relationships. They also have an increased belief that porn is a useful information to learn about sex and real-world experiences. And they also have a decreased belief that sex is affectionate and relational, and an increased belief that sex is primarily physical and casual. So here's some good news. There have been some research studies that have been done on kids who don't use pornography and who are stopping using pornography. And what they show is that adolescents who choose not to use pornography or consume any sexually explicit material have higher degrees of social interaction and bonding. And that when youth who started off using pornography on a very regular basis work to decrease their consumption of it, that their confidence grows, their individual levels of confidence grow. So here's a suggested code that I think parents can teach their kids about pornography, is that they make sure in their family code to pledge to protect their brain and their body from too much dopamine, no matter where that comes from. Drugs, alcohol, pornography, technology overuse. And two, that they learn how to communicate well in relationships, that they ask questions to get to know their partners so they know what they like, know what they're interested in, that they share things about themselves so they can get, so they can increase levels of knowledge and trust, that they be considerate and respectful of themselves as well as other people, that they practice having a positive body image, and that they pledge to keep themselves safe and to never do anything they don't want to do or be pressured by anyone to do something that they don't. Because of the high rate of violence in pornography, what we see is that on college campuses, an increase in violent requests for, I shouldn't say violent requests for more violent sexual activity that many young people have seen in pornography, but are, when it comes down to real life, are very scared to engage in that behavior. But if they find themselves in a relationship with somebody who's pressuring them, most likely give in and then end up feeling quite disgusted or disrespectful or victimized. So we also want to teach our kids no for sexting or naked pictures. There's fantastic software out there. One of my favorite software companies is called Bark. And it, once you install it on all the devices in your home, it looks for certain keywords with algorithms, and it will send you a notification when your child has watched pornography or gone on a website or said something that is a keyword, or even in teen speak, it looks for all those things. And then it sends you an email that says, do you need help talking about this issue with your child? And it gives you some pointers. What I find is that sexting and naked pictures is part of this kind of hookup pornography normalized culture. I've had young teenagers say to me, Doc, don't you understand? That's just how we talk to each other. That's how we express intimacy today. And I just got to say, I think that that's bullshit because they're learning that from sources that are on these pornographic sites or this violent advertising, and people are not talking to them about what really healthy, slow build up, healthy relationship continuums look like. So we can work with kids on helping them create a healthy body image. And remember that how you see yourself in the mirror, how you picture yourself in your mind, what you believe about your appearance, or what you think other people think about your appearance and how you feel about your body is body image. And it is very closely related to self-esteem. So parents, we have got to start working with kids about being natural, being loving toward our bodies and appreciative instead of self-deprecating. So I have come to the end of my slides, and so this is the time for questions, and I see the chat box is full, but I also want to share with you some information about the book that I just finished as a part of my fellowship at the Hope and Healing Center. It's called the Neuro Whereabouts Guide. It teaches parents all about healthy brain development and how high-risk behaviors change that trajectory. And then it's got an elementary, middle, and high school chapter which shows on a graph which high-risk behaviors spike and at what time, so that you know when to have your discussions. And then the whole chapter 6, which is 100 pages long, is full of scripts and talks and discussion checklists for each developmental age for those 18 different high-risk behavior. It also has things like contracts and different checklists of things to teach your kids so that you're ready for all of those discussions. Okay, so at this point, I want to open it up, and Cody, how would you like me to do this? Have you been looking at the chat?
I had someone ask earlier, is erectile dysfunction truly due to internet porn? Or is it just one of the effects of internet porn?
So it is an effect of desensitizing your brain to sexually explicit material. And so we know that watching pornography consistently and for longer and longer periods of time, and that it creates novelty seeking for greater and greater shock factor. And that translates to different dopamine spikes in the brain. And when those dopamine spikes go above our normal threshold, it makes structural changes that now have an effect on the rest of our body, desensitizing our brain, which means that we just don't get an erection or aroused like we used to, because sex happens in our brain first.
What words do you suggest to use when you know your teen is looking at porn, but you don't want to shame them?
That's a great question. So it also kind of depends on how old your teen is, but the Good Pictures, Bad Pictures actually has a book that is for older kids, and it has a great section in the back with questions on how to talk about it. So I think that it's important to say, hey kiddo, this may not be something that you want to talk about, but we need to, and we need to have this conversation more than once. But I'm going to ask you lots of questions instead of just lecturing to you. And so we need you to know that we, in our family, excuse me, we don't want you to look at pornography because of how it affects your brain. So if you want some information about how it affects your brain, I can share that with you, or you can watch this video from a doctor who just talked about it. But we want you to protect your own frontal lobe. But we also know that it has negative effects on it makes you think that this is what relationships are about. So let's talk a little bit about what have you seen? What does that make you think about that relationships are like this? You know, what are your questions? So please know, I've actually done this type of presentation at middle schools and in high schools. And the 45 minutes that they give me is never enough. I cannot tell you how many questions that I get from boys and girls after that via email asking about this, because their parents are not talking about this, and they really want to learn how what they're learning is not actually reality, because for them, it's all they know. So then they go out and replicate the behavior in their relationships and are really uncomfortable or victimized. So hopefully that helped. And some of the scripts in the book will also help with that too.
As a therapist, at what stage do I need to refer the student to a psychiatrist versus working on it through behavioral therapy?
Well, I think, so when I hear psychiatrist, I think about medication. And so medication is never the first thing that we would do. But, you know, if especially if I've got a kid who has chronic depression or chronic anxiety that they are not able to use talk therapy or coping skills with, and of course, an anxiety disorder, it has to last for 6 months or longer. If somebody has depressive episodes, which are, you know, 2 weeks, very intense, and if they have multiple depressive episodes, that is when I would definitely work with a psychiatrist. I have to say, though, I am very, very careful. And I work with just a few psychiatrists who really know kids and also understand that there are some medications that can be addictive to the brain. And so they assess them quite well. I try to get them to do QEEGs before getting on medications, so we know exactly what are the waves going on in their brain. And we know a lot about those today and can pick a good medication depending upon a kiddo's brain activity. And so as a therapist, I think that knowing the 11 to 12 symptoms of addiction are critical. When you get to more than 3, that's when you need to start involving parents or other potential caregivers to start modifying the behavior.
Do you recommend any specific evidence-based treatment modality to work with arousal addiction for adolescents and adults in individual therapy? Let me know if you need me to read that again.
No, I think, so modality. I really practice a lot of integrative work. I do a lot of cognitive, behavioral, and affective ways, but what I find is that young kids today are not necessarily using it to escape things. There are a certain subset of porn users that use it every single day that have lower levels of connection to their family. They have socialization difficulty, and that's why family therapy is important, is to reconnect kids to healthy family systems or to work on a family system. Because if a child is getting healthy dopamine spikes from a healthy family environment, then they don't really need to look for that dopamine spike anywhere else. And also sometimes I've got, you know, kids who are exposed to this and don't, for instance, I'm working with somebody who was exposed at a sleepover and didn't tell a parent until a year later. And my goodness, that child could not figure out if something had happened to her, if it was assault, if it was what it was, because she'd actually watched it on TV. She had no idea really what pornography was until all of a sudden her peer that she was sleeping over with flashed it in her face. It was very off-putting. So I think that it's whatever modality that you choose to use, family therapy and coaching families to talk about it before kids are exposed is really critical.
Thank you, Dr. Collier. Porn is akin to a soft selling peddling of sexual violence. I believe that its mainstream acceptance of it has a knock-on effect on rape. Is there any info about this?
So yes, and you know, I read a lot of prevention articles, and so in those articles, what they show is a lot of outcomes about that, and so the hookup culture being one of those outcomes is that it rewards the hookup culture even more, and because kids have phones, they're making amateur pornographic videos in college of some very violent scenes. And when that gets proliferated, people see this and it rewards that glamorization of violent interactions, which I think definitely has a causal and a very high correlational coefficient for rape and sexual assault. if you know, the majority of pornography is objectification of women. And in the past couple decades, the majority of pornography not only objectifies women, but subjects them to being an object of violence, and it portrays them as wanting it and liking it. How can that not have an effect on an increase in sexual violence in our culture? You know, there's a question here that I want to, as a pediatric nurse, how would you open a discussion about porn? And so I think you as a pediatric nurse have like the best avenue in it, because you have tons of questions that you have to ask too. If you just put pornography on your list and make it a norm to ask, do you use pornography? What is the frequency? How long do you use it? That way you know that you need to share with that child what you've learned, that pornography can change the brain just like a drug or alcohol can. And then you can even potentially open up the discussion and normalize the discussion and refer that child to a therapist so that they can continue that discussion.
Well, speaking to your kids before they view porn, obviously preferable. If you miss the window and they've already seen it, well, talking to them after the fact, they have the same mitigating effect.
Oh, most definitely. I think, you know, we can't prevent it all from happening. We just can't. And so, you know, a lot of times you'll go to your kid and they'll be like, oh yeah, I've already looked at it, or I've already done that. And I'm like, oh my God. And then you can stop and say, hey, you know, I'm sorry that I didn't talk to you about this beforehand, but I just want you to know that this is a value in our family, that we don't look at that. And so are you able to not look at it, to say no? What are your refusal skills? You know, if your buddies show you a nude picture or whatever, like, what do you say? Let's practice that. And then you can say, and, you know, on our monitoring software, if we see that you're looking at that, we're going to give you a consequence for that. You know, we don't want you to use your technology to look at pornographic images. So if we find that you are, we're going to intervene by making sure that you only use your technology at the dining room table where we can monitor it for a certain period of time. And we're going to book an appointment with the therapist so that we can, as a family, discuss this as a whole. So that may seem like a lot and very scary, but it's important to let a child know that there will be consequences if they continue to go against the family code. And remember, you have scientific justification to say no to pornography because of what it does to the brain. And so, you know, there was a question there about, I guess I shouldn't, you can forbid it, but you also have to know that they probably will look at it again, and that you and your monitoring software will catch it, and you'll be able to sit and say, hey, I don't want to shame you, I don't want to punish you, but that is a rule that we have in this family, is not to use our technology for looking at things like that. And so here's the consequences for that. Now tell me, you know, are you just curious, or are there other reasons why you're looking at this? Let's talk about how it might affect your relationships.
My last question here is dealing with, would porn addiction predispose individuals to other forms of addictions, such as substance abuse, etc.? With your experience in all realms of addiction, do you see that pornography, if kind of left unchecked with maybe our kids or ourselves or our couples, you know, would that open the door for more addictions with other substances?
Oh, definitely. So I'm going to answer that question. And the last question that came in is, do you consider porn as a childhood traumatic experience? And it definitely is. For this kiddo that I just worked with, it's traumatic. She didn't know what to think about it. So we had to normalize that this is a normal experience, to get blindsided with information. We defined it as not assault, and we talked about what it was and what it was not. Now, if you have increased neuroreceptor sites for dopamine in your brain from porn exposure, video game exposure, other behaviors that are addictive, then you use tobacco, nicotine, alcohol, or another illicit street drug, your brain has been primed to become addictive to that faster because you already have the structure. So this is why early prevention and consistent education throughout development, as well as monitoring, is pretty critical. I'll leave you with this last thing that I find so interesting. Parents always say to me, but you know, well, I did it, you know, and I'm okay. Well, yes. But what we see is that today we have more avenues for high risk behavior to be exposed to our kids younger and younger and younger. So, you know, when kids say, "What, you don't trust me?" I want you to say back to them, "You're right. I don't trust the part of your brain that hasn't finished growing. I trust that part that has completed growth, but I'm going to trust you and verify just to keep your frontal lobe safe." So thanks you guys so much for being here today. If you would like the slide deck, I would happily send that to you if you want to send me an email. And if you want to be on the blast list for when the book comes out, please let me know.